Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Black Cauldron from 1985. Now, after last week and watching The Secret of NIMH and thinking about the 80s and the state of animation and children's movies and various technologies and media companies at that time, I got to thinking again about all of the Disney movies that I have not seen. As I've mentioned before, my childhood was not filled with much Disney, and most of the stuff that I did see was substantially older. So I was thinking about movies that other folks have talked about before, and as I was just sort of flipping through, I realized that The Black Cauldron fits sort of right in the niche, right around the 80s, which is sort of known as this weird, dark time in Disney's past. I talked about in the last video how this was in part due to an exodus of talent from Disney following the 70s, and a rather substantial sea change in its staffing and the C-suite executives and et cetera, et cetera. And it affected a lot of what they made and how it was made. There's a bunch of background stuff that I want to talk about this as well, but I don't want to spend too much time on it, so I think we're going to come back to it because it's relevant talking about some of the actual contents of this movie. I'm not going to beat around the bush on this one too much, and I'm going to say just outright that I don't think this is a very good movie. Now, that's not that controversial of an opinion, or at least not as controversial as I thought, because as I was trying to sort through my memory and think of who had mentioned this movie before, I couldn't pinpoint anyone. I was trying to figure out as well what exactly I was watching, because a lot of these Disney movies, especially in the 90s and 2000s, were getting re-releases and video releases and getting advertisements run for them, even if it was just advertisements at the beginning of other VHSs. And so I was trying to think of the images I had in my head, these vague images from so many years ago, of what some of those movies looked like. And I swore I knew what this movie was. And it took me about 20 minutes into the film to realize, oh, I was thinking of The Sword and the Stone, not The Black Cauldron. Those are two very different films. The Sword and the Stone came out in 1963. This came out in 1985. And while I did technically watch the right one, because I was trying to watch something contemporary to Secret of NIMH, that did sort of throw me for a loop for a bit. This is a movie that did not perform well when it released. And that's in spite of the fact that it was in a period where at least Disney was not releasing very much. Prior to, according to what I looked up, the last movie that Walt Disney Animations had made prior to this was The Fox and the Hound in 1981. And then before that, there was another big gap since 1977. It had been that long since they had made an animated feature. And there were quite a few more that would come out into, well, I guess not too many, but a decent number, one every year or so, into the 80s. But this was sort of, it had been some substantial time since Disney's sort of animation heyday. There's a bunch of technical background on this movie that I didn't realize until reading up on it after the fact that also gets into some of my technical misgivings with how this movie was produced. But I think what's also particularly interesting is that this movie performed pretty badly at the time, but not for lack of some decent reviews. What's interesting in reading back on some of those reviews is also realizing that those reviews sometimes come without good context. And I mean that specifically because until about 1985, you could not rewatch movies. Even for somebody who's as old as I am, that is sometimes something we forget. That there was a very substantial chunk of cinematic history that only ended about 40 years ago when you could not rewatch movies because there was no way to do it. Now, there were some really niche ways of doing it, and technically VHS existed substantially before 1985, but before that it was prohibitively expensive for almost everyone. And in addition, when the technology is expensive, the products don't really get made for it. So there's a whole history there. There's if you actually want some real technological history, go check out the I mean, they don't need my recommendation. They're huge, but Technology Connections on YouTube is an excellent channel for some really nerdy deep dives into some very specific technologies. And they did a series of videos on VHS and a number of other video formats. But I say this specifically because with this movie coming out in 1985, and at that time, very few there being very little ability to rewatch older films. Comparing media side by side and having a clear memory of how good things actually did or didn't look is not a comparison that could reasonably be made all that often, or at least not by the average person. And I think that's really important for some of my concerns about how this movie was produced. Now, it's worth noting that this also is a movie that basically only existed in theaters up until well into the 90s. I think I scanned over and it was only re-released for the first time in like 1998 or something like that. And so there's a whole chunk of time when people would have forgot about it as well. But at the time, it was considered a commercial flop by the Disney company and basically everybody associated with it. And that was to the chagrin of some people, also because it is based on a series of books by Lloyd Alexander, who's known as a rather prolific writer of, I guess, young adult fiction. In the earlier part of the 20th century. And so having this movie both not perform very well and even internally not be considered to be that good of a film, that all really adds up to a very weird film to watch today. Now, I am aware that even now there are some people who really like this film. Some of you may even be watching this video by random happenstance. And I don't want to say that this is an awful film, but especially when compared to other things that were being released by Disney, both before and after, and other things that were being released contemporaneously with this from other companies, including even The Secret of NIMH, which you heard my concerns about that one. The Secret of NIMH looks very like a much better piece of cinema than this when you compare them side by side, and it was 3 years prior and from a smaller company doing it independently. Now, there's a bunch of technical background as well on the actual production of this film that may or may not make it better or worse. This is the first this was, at the time it was released, the most expensive animated film ever made, I believe. That was in no small part due to cost overruns, but it was already going to be extremely expensive. part of that expense was that it was also pioneering several technologies, including the use of some computer graphics and the delivery in, I might be getting this wrong. I think it's Dolby Stereo or Dolby Surround Sound. I'm not sure which one it is. Hold on. It is Dolby Stereo. Okay, that actually adds more detail to something I'm going to talk about with the audio. This is not a very pretty movie. It's not ugly. It's not grossly bad, but it does sometimes not look very good. It sometimes looks very flat. It sometimes looks very sort of unpolished. There are a lot of inconsistencies between scenes and layering styles and shading styles and even colors that make it look kind of all over the place. And in addition to stylistically, the characters especially are drawn and colored very flat pretty much consistently throughout. And that makes them rather visually uninteresting and juxtaposed very strongly, and not in a positive way, against a lot of hand-drawn scenery. It was very typical for, hand-drawn animation that you have static backgrounds with moving characters over the top, and this might be one of the more glaring cases, at least, maybe not the most, of seeing the distinction between the background images and the animation cells on top of those images, where many of the background images on their own are truly beautiful paintings, full of, lots of careful and subtle coloring and lighting and use of stylistic choices to portray a certain emotional or environmental effect going on in a scene. The characters are largely not done with any of that polish. In fact, very near it's inconsistent throughout the film. It does crop up throughout the film, but very near the end of the film, there is a scene where one of the major characters is monologuing as basically the only character on screen, and some of the, in addition to just the other problems I've already mentioned, the line work on the character is so rough. It looks like a sketch. It looks like nobody did the final pen work on the cells. It just looks unfinished. There's a whole bunch of other animation problems that are scattered throughout this film, including what look like cells that never got a final pass to remove some of the underlayers, or other things that is just like, why is that have that extra outline in this blue color or something like that. And it just looks very kind of sloppy and unprofessional, inconsistently throughout, and sometimes more glaring than others, but never really. I was really hoping that at some point there'd be a chunk of the film that really got pretty and really sort of surprised me, and it never did. And when you have these contrasting and conflicting visual styles between the backgrounds and foregrounds, and and even on the occasions when they do use the CGI overlays, those being another layer of visually conflicting information, it really, to me, makes me want to look back at older films, the stuff that Disney was making 15, 25, even 35 or 45 years before, and see how much better those films look. Now, ultimately, when you come to hand-drawn animation, it's always about the people behind it. It's about the the technical knowledge and the technical ability of the people who are drawing and producing these things. It's how experienced are they? How well do they understand how this will look as finally animated cells? And how much money are you willing to throw at it to make, the right levels of polish be done on it and make sure that all of the cells are up to snuff. And I can only speculate as to what exactly happened in the the production level. But given that there is a fairly well-known, apparently storied history of the higher level production problems that this film was having, including like newly appointed executives, specifically both Jeffrey Katzenberg and what's the other guy's name? I was just looking at it. The two guys who ended up hating each other at Disney, this was sort of the start of their feud. This is the feud that came to a climax with the creation of DreamWorks Studios, because these two guys disagreed so consistently on how the company should be run, how the movie should be produced, etc., etc. And I think this is sort of their first clash, to the point that like these executives, I think Katzenberg specifically is cited as, after the animation teams refused to do the edits, he went into the editing booth and ordered the movie edited the movie himself. And then it was hold on, let me get the other name because it's going to bother me if I don't actually get it. Michael Eisner, who's the other half of this historic feud in the U.S. animation industry, ends up going and like telling him off for doing that. Now, that the reasons for those edits are also interesting and also get to something that I think is weird about this film, which is that it is tonally not very consistent. The one thing that is consistent is that it is largely not very appropriate for a lot of children. I would say this is a movie that tonally doesn't know who it's shooting for. And that also is echoed in the writing and story. Because structurally, on its surface, this movie looks like a film, or reads like a film for maybe up to the age of 12, I would say. It has an extremely simple story going on. Most of the scenes barely connect to each other. They are just a new scene in a new place because some in-between thing happened to make them move to a new location. And structurally, it's not very engaging. Likewise, the characters are not very fleshed out, not very interesting, and written in their dialogue is written in very dull ways that doesn't say a whole lot and doesn't even really inform their characterization in any particularly strong way. Meanwhile, the actual content of the scenes on screen and even the themes that are occasionally being surfaced are very dark. And while it's cited that the ending in particular in test screenings was found to be traumatic to children, I can see scenes throughout this whole film that I think are too dark or tonally disturbing for a child of the age that I think the writing points towards. I don't think that this is a movie that's probably, the content of which is probably appropriate for an age under 12. Meanwhile, the writing itself is not appropriate for an age over 12. And so you've got this very sort of narrow age gap with a, plus or minus a few years, where this falls into a really weird place. Now, as I've touched on before, that's not entirely unique for the history of animated films all the way up through the 90s and even 2000s, of movie producers not really having a great idea of the trauma they're about to inflict on an entire generation of children. But especially when this film isn't doing a whole lot with it, and isn't even, visually stunning enough to be memorable for adults, it's a hard sell. Nobody really seems to be the appropriate market for this film. It's made even further problematic by these other technical things that I talked about already. The one being the computer graphics, which are a little bit hard to identify. I think it is mostly in visual effects, and it has some visual similarity. The things that I think I can identify have a lot of visual similarity to Tron. If you've seen Tron, which is also not a particularly good film and also kind of a tech demo, like this one kind of is, those visuals don't stand up very well to time, and aren't really super impressive. They also have a lot of sort of visual indicators of where and what they are, because of things like extremely high glow and sort of flashing and things like that. And especially when it comes for kids, I mean, this is not something that would really come into public discourse until sort of the late 90s, I think. But the problems of having flashing lights on screen, it's one thing to, it's just sort of hard and unpleasant on the eyes, but also the rise in recognition of epileptic seizures and things like that can be triggered by flashing lights and the like. This movie has a lot of flashing lights in it, especially when those effects are there. And they're not even, some of them are really ugly and don't age well. Some of them are actually pretty good, but are so flashy that you're sort of squinting to try and see what the effect really looks like. And there's a good effect somewhere in there, but it's ultimately not done super well. Even worse, though, is the audio editing. And when you've got a movie that is being, is their first one being made in Dolby Stereo, that's a whole other can of worms. Now, I didn't bother to look up actually what the preceding technology they had been using was, and there's a whole discussion to be had about the difference between mono and stereo audio, as well as specifically Dolby versus other audio formats, and how they were actually sort of connected to the film. Dolby is notable for being one of the early technologies that printed audio visually onto the film and was read by a separate track reader that was built into the camera or the projector itself, rather than being in some way read separately or even delivered as a completely separate track, which was occasionally a thing, less and less common as time went on. What's glaring about it is, one, just how bad some of the audio editing is in this film. There are certain sounds, certain things that just clip in and out, certain clips that seem to have been either let run too long or cut too short, and so they just sort of go bah! And then that's just there's just a really sharp noise for no particular reason, because nobody did an extra pass on the audio. This could be a problem with the transfer from their original edit to the Dolby system, but like, I don't know, I can't account for that. There's tons of other problems with it as well, including just the general mastering quality is pretty nasty. It is kind of sloppy all over the place. There's not a lot of smoothed out audio from various vocal tracks that are used throughout the movie. or for the various characters, and also because this movie is notably not a musical, which most of Disney's films were at least partially a musical prior to this. This not being one sort of makes it even more glaring when the music is supposed to be, I mean, it's like a movie soundtrack. It's supposed to be sort of mostly in the background, and sometimes it swells and sometimes it hides more. But overall, the audio, the musical tracks tend to be too loud. Apparently, there's a history there too, including the fact that some of these tracks may not even be original. They may not be the original compositions, or they may be retransfers of the compositions because they were not in the practice of doing necessarily great archival work. Some of the original recordings were either not ready for this film when it released at all, or ended up being lost in transfers at one time or another. There's some note here about it being recovered at a later time, and maybe reintroduced, but I don't even know whether to credit the music, all of the music, to the composers of who are credited. Weirdly, possibly the best mastered and written piece of music in the entire thing is the one that plays over the credits. And there are some decent compositions somewhere in the middle of the film, but they are largely so overbearing or mastered poorly that they're just very aggressive. All the even worse thing, and I know I keep kind of saying that, but it just kind of keeps going downhill, is that they deeply overuse the stereo effect, and it makes the whole thing feel like a tech demo. Now, again, this was originally put in theaters, and when it was released to video, it probably didn't get I don't know that it necessarily got a stereo transfer either. Again, that's a question for whether the VHSs that were released actually got mono or stereo. They may have just gotten a mono mix down. But watching this with headphones on, I hear every detail of the crossfading they are doing, and they do it aggressively. It's not even just, hey, this character's off to this one, off screen or off to this side of the screen, and we're trying to give you an idea of like spatially where they are. When a character is in the middle of the screen and you're facing them head on and they're the only character in the screen and they lean to the left or right, it excuse me, I'm getting a little heated about this. The audio aggressively pans their voice from one side to the other. It's not poorly done, it's just way overdone. It's not like it just randomly sloppily switches from one side to the other. It's just they only moved half a step to one side or the other, and suddenly they are twice as loud as they've overpanned it. This is consistent throughout the film, all different characters, all different sorts of things, sound effects that this also happens for, while still having all of those same mastering problems of certain elements being too high in the mix, too low in the mix, like too apparent, things that are supposed to be kind of subtle or too loud, things that are supposed to be very aggressive or too soft. And that also adds to even some of the things that are inappropriate for kids, like an early scene where there's a barking dog and it's so loud in one ear that it's the mastering plus the panning just is truly like you get taken aback. It's already a jump scare on screen. It's worse because of the audio. This movie is just a technical mess, and while no single element is like offensively poor, when you put it up against so many other things that were being done better, even by the same company, even 40 plus years before this movie, it's hard to look at this and not be, I don't know, at least kind of, at the very least, disappointed. And I think that's what a lot of people, even at the time, came away from this with, was just that it's kind of a disappointment. I don't know necessarily what to make of this film, and if this is one of your favorites, if you're in the group of people who think this is a cult classic, I'm really interested to hear what you have to say, despite all my misgivings, as I always am. But I just can't identify this as anything more than sort of a weird technical stumbling block and a bit of a tech demo in the middle of an era when the company was struggling, not entirely sure what to do, and missing a lot of the technical aptitude required to be its very best. I don't know. I think as well, because I was so hopeful for sort of a kid-oriented adventure story, that also just disappointed me. And I don't think that's an unfair assessment to have, to have either, because that's what people would have been going in wanting. You know, you see a Disney film, an animated Disney film targeted at kids with a kid with a sword on the cover, and, you know, all these fantastical elements, and you're hoping for something that's Disney-ish. And when that company had so many much better showings so many years before, I definitely understand this being disappointing at the time, and I think it's disappointing now as well. On that note, I might just end up watching The Sword and the Stone as well, and seeing if it's worth making a comment on, or worth doing a whole video on as a contrast. But yeah, this was a weird movie, and it feels too technically inept even for the time that it came out. There were too many other companies making too much good work in the mid to late 80s, or even the early 80s and before, for this to be really acceptable to me. It's just kind of a flop in too many ways. Anyway, like I said, if you really like this, or if you really don't, please leave me a comment, and I'm curious to hear what everybody has to say. Alright, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.